Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Inclusion Starts Now. I am thrilled for you to listen to Al talk about everything that he knows. He is just, every time I talk to him, I seriously can't even articulate what I want to say fast enough back to him. Um, you are going to hear so much. He is just truly amazing. Before we get to that, I just want to say that conferences. Today, I want to talk about conferences. For people who are either identify as disabled or identify as an advocate to the disabled community, find conferences around you. There are so many. I do try to share them when I know that they're coming up, when registration is coming up. Al and I met at Tash, and we will talk about that in a little bit. Tash also has a Cal Tash conference that is coming up at the end of March. So go look into conferences. We will talk about it a little bit in this episode because community, man, that's what it's all about. Okay, enjoy the episode. Today I'm here to talk to Al, and I met Al. I think the first time we talked was in Washington, D.C. at Tash. And I don't even know if you remember this because then I told you at New Orleans, I'm like, yes, I met you last year. And you were like, okay. But your conversation, like you just said so many things that made my brain just like go off into all these different directions that I was just like, I left just like I felt like a totally new person. And you were probably like giving me really basic information that you just like share with people. And then I got to see you present in New Orleans at Tash, and that was amazing. Um, so that is pretty much how I met you. But do you want to give like a little intro about yourself?
Sure. I do have to open with this disclaimer here. I am a family medicine resident. I'm a doctor. Nothing I say reflects the views of my employer, the school I went to, or my profession as a whole. But to put it very simply, I'm autistic and I'm a doctor, and that has given me a bit of a very specific perspective on disability issues because the medical profession is very divorced from the disability rights movement and how we approach things. Which has just sort of led to me going down this rabbit hole of doing a lot of research on disabled communities and disability intersectionality, on medical ableism and physical violence in medical settings, and ultimately just some ways we can possibly bridge that gap where possible.
Yeah. I mean, are there any ideas on the spot of how to bridge that gap?
I mean, I think the big thing is healthcare is as a whole becoming more aware of the concept of structural and implicit bias. And it has made some gains in recent years to try to undo parts of that. One of the big victories was about 3 years ago, the GFR correction was removed from medical calculations. Have you heard of that?
No.
So, due to some quote unquote research in the 19th century that said that Black people's muscles work differently than white people's, it was considered a matter of scientific gospel until about 3 years ago that you should adjust calculations of kidney function in Black individuals compared to everyone else. Um, this created the illusion that Black people's kidneys were not experiencing kidney strain and injury at the same rate as everyone else's, which led to this mystery where certain patients would seem to be doing great and then suddenly go into renal failure.
Yeah.
And this served to keep Black patients off of transplant lists, to prevent them from seeing nephrologists. It just created a lot of structural issues because no one had never gone back and re-examined these old racist assumptions. And so medicine is trying to become aware of things like that and to do things about them. But disability is a pretty, I mean, I'm not saying they're doing great by race or anything, they're not. But disability is a pretty obvious gap, even in this mindset, because there is this underlying assumption in medicine that disability is a thing to be fixed or cured, the medical model.
Yeah.
This idea that disability is not an identity category and is not a group of people, it is a group of problems to be fixed in otherwise normal people. And this underlies a lot of issues with medicine. And one of the big ones is that there's this sort of invisible hierarchy in medicine between, doctors are supposed to be healthy and perfect and functioning at 110% at all times, and patients are sick and deserve our grace and our condescension. This serves to rather explicitly keep disabled people out of the medical profession. And unless they are capable of masking or concealing disability to a very high degree. And the problem with that is that a lot of these slow, painful reforms we're making in issues like race and gender bias and LGBTQ bias have come as the result of representation in the field. Um, Rather famously, the correction to the DSM that removed homosexuality as a diagnostic illness only came in part because of members of the Gay PA, which were closeted members of the American Psychiatric Association, but they needed a foot in
Yeah.
the door to do that. And that doesn't happen with people who are visibly disabled to the same extent, because
Yeah.
visible disability is a disqualifying part of being a doctor for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean that, oh my gosh. Again, see, it's every time you talk, I just like my brain, it's like I probably need to just sit here and take notes so I can remember everything that I want to say back to you. Um, oh my gosh. Okay, so like the ableism in the medical field. We did kind of talk about that, I think, in New Orleans, because I was telling you that I feel like that's where ableism really starts for like a lot of families, that it's like the first diagnosis they get, they're just like, I'm so sorry that this happened. Here, this is how we're going to try to fix your child. Um, and it's like right off the bat, like this ableist thing. Um, and I mean, I've kind of just gotten to a point where I feel like it's, so much mindset and like this cultural thing that we have to change, which is like really hard because people have these like embedded biases like so inside of them that they don't even realize it. I mean, is there anything that you feel like have you, now that you're like in the medical field, do you feel like that you've been able to kind of call people out or be like, well, I don't know, what about this? Or get people to rethink now that you're like in there with them?
I mean, here and there, it occasionally happens. It's very tricky because a lot of the time I have to frame that as coming from a position of allyship, because it's still not safe to be openly disabled in most settings in medicine,
Yeah.
um, which can be very frustrating. And that's been true. It's been true in medical school. It's been true as a doctor. It's Yeah, and it does not help that medicine as a whole, coming from the kind of social backgrounds it does, a lot of people in medicine are just sort of by default a little more conservative. Not a ton. They hate insurance as much as the rest of us, but probably more. But people do not like the idea of they feel there are a lot of older doctors, especially, who feel like medicine has gone too PC and too woke with those attempts to change the structural things I've been talking about, and are kind of hostile to the concept of trying to view disability as anything other than a tragedy.
Yeah. Which is like interesting because I would think if you're like gonna go into the medical field, you're kind of going into it because there's like an area that you like and you want to learn more about it to change it. Like I would think that's why, like if a doctor is going into like cancer or like especially like like a specific cancer like breast cancer, I would assume they're not just doing it to get rid of cancer, that they also want to learn about it to like figure out a cure, figure out how do we make it not so bad. So it's like I guess that's interesting that I wouldn't really think that doctors would think that they've like capped off learning, that they're like, nope, this doesn't need to change. We're fine here. Because it's like they're there. Aren't they seeing it that it's not working?
I mean, I think you're kind of pointing to a kind of very fundamental issue with the way doctors think, which is that I'm trying to look up this essay, which is why you can hear me typing. There's this fantastic essay in the Disability Studies Reader that really changed my perspective on this, which was, all right. But basically, what it talks about is this thing in American history where disability has been seen as such a non-entity in terms of identity and in terms of respect that it can be used as an insult or a weapon against literally any group. And in medicine, the way that kind of plays out is, yes, you can have a doctor who really wants to, help women, and that's why they go into the field that they go into. But what that means for them is spare women early death, but also disability. Um, and you can have a doctor who cares very deeply about fighting breast cancer in everyone, but that's because they have this fantasy idea of someone living without breast cancer in perfect health until they're 80. The
Yeah.
idea of it being okay that someone's baseline is using a wheelchair or is not speaking the way that you speak, or any of these other things, that can be very difficult to internalize because it doesn't look like what they think health should look like.
Yeah. It like makes me like I have never sat in a medical class or anything, but I would just be so interested in like I mean like kind of defining healthy. Like I feel like that is kind of one of those things where especially I mean as someone who has recently had children and has gone through childbirth, I remember so many people being like, you know, what do you have a birth plan? What's your birth plan? And a lot of people will answer just like, I just hope for a healthy baby. And then if you get a baby, like if your baby ends up having a disability, then people feel like they're not healthy, which was in because I was one that was like, well, I just want a healthy baby, but I guess I wouldn't have said a disability means that they're not healthy. I mean, I guess it depends on like their health status, but I don't know. What do you think about that? About
I
like
think,
healthy?
well, I think that gets into a lot of things because there is also a lot of, sort of internalized tension within disability rights circles between, healthy and unhealthy disabled. There are people who would define themselves as unhealthy disabled who, in some cases would want to cure, would want things to change. And I'm not going to begrudge them that. If you've got a, progressive illness that is, going to kill you early, wanting it to stabilize, wanting it to change, and if even if you don't have that, wanting that kind of outcome is, that is an individual thing. Um, and so I think it has more to do with this overwhelming cultural pressure to, improve, to get to a particular physical standard. And because it kind of reduces the concept of free choice. I'm not explaining this terribly well, but
No, you are. I the last line you said though, I feel like that, okay, reduce it. Say that last. Do you remember the
it,
last line you just said?
this overwhelming cultural pressure kind of reduces free choice.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of like the concept of choice feminism. This idea that any choice a woman makes is inherently feminist, so we should not judge the content of that choice. And that's true, sort of, but it kind of has this background assumption that choices are made in a vacuum and that there aren't economic pressures driving the choice to say work versus live in the home. Um,
Yeah.
and there's a very similar dynamic when we talk about health and disability, because when a lot of parents, especially, say they want their kid to be healthy or they want their kid to be able-bodied, a lot of what they mean is, I'm afraid of my child not being able to support themselves someday.
Yeah.
And that really isn't an expression of hatred for disabled children or of overt ableism. It's an expression of awareness that disability is not well supported in our society,
Yeah.
even though they would never put it in these terms, because a lot of people don't think in these sort of structural terms. It's awareness that, from their perspective, their kid is not going to measure up to what is expected of an able-bodied adult, and they want a kid who can do that someday.
Yes. And I do think that that is, I mean, oh my gosh. Okay. So thinking of like behaviors a lot, like when I'm working with a child or like my own kids of being like, you know, helping them with behavior, it's like I'm trying to help them have tools for when other people's unplanned behavior goes towards them, and then they're like, "Whoa, what's happening?" But then responding in like a safe, healthy way. So it's like making me think of like when, oh my gosh, when people are like being ableist or if something like ableist happens, it's like how, oh my gosh, you're responding or viewing it. Because like I know, um, I just got speech for my child, my youngest, and I remember the first thought that I had was like, I don't want to have to like tell people. Like, I don't want to have to explain to people why I chose this or why I asked to get the support. But it was like, how was that like my initial response? I don't even know. I meant to bring up the social model of disability because I want you to talk about that. But this, again, my head is just like spinning in so many different directions of like, it's just like these models and this like culture that is just here. And it's like, how do we navigate it when it seems like less of us is trying to encourage more people to like not be ableist or to like see the positives in disability or just see that like they're also like people with disabilities are just like also humans that should also be cared for and treated as such. Do you want to talk about the social model of disability?
Sure.
I feel like this is a good transition into that.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to give a basic definition, a lot of people talk about disability studies for the past 30 years, and I forget exactly who coined this. I know it was in the 70s, but um, talk about sort of these two models, the medical and social model of disability. The medical model of disability is the one that most people are sort of passively familiar with, which is that disability is an individual failing, it is a problem to be addressed, it is a medical issue that needs to be diagnosed and treated by healthcare providers. And then the social model, which is frequently misunderstood in modern parlance, by the way, because all ideas get oversimplified as they get repeated. But
Mhm.
it's this idea that there's a distinction between an impairment and a disability. An impairment is a physical difference that reduces your ability to do something. A good example would be I wear glasses because, and so do you, because my eyesight's not
Yeah.
great. Um, but this is an impairment because there is no social stigma attached to wearing glasses. Insurance will cover glasses up to a certain point. It does not impede my ability to work or to live my life as everyone else does to wear glasses because there are often accommodations built in for people who wear glasses, goggles that go over them. If I'm in a lab environment, people are a certain percentage of the populace is expected to have glasses. So it's just an understood thing. And that is not true of my autism. Um, Autism is a disability not because it inherently represents a greater impairment than, my astigmatism, but rather because there are no accommodations for it. There is no expectation that that is how some people exist, and there is no expectation that if people exist that way, they can and should function outside of the home. Um, as such, there aren't educational accommodations for us. There aren't workplace accommodations. And even trying to obtain or request those accommodations can often be a deeply stigmatizing and often doomed to fail process. Um, I've had a lot of difficulty getting accommodations in a lot of different settings because the accommodations I request are not standard accommodations. And people tend to assume that because I talk and look the way I do, that that means I am, quote unquote, high functioning enough to not require any accommodations. Um, and which is to say that, if you lock me alone in a room, I'm still autistic. That doesn't go away. But there is a social context that differentiates impairment from disability.
Yeah. What would be, this doesn't even have to be a personal example, but what would you say an example of an accommodation for an autistic person, like in a work setting or something, or any setting? What would that look like?
Well, there's actually a great example from Chash, which you may have noticed in the years going there, which is that they always have quiet rooms,
Yeah.
which I really appreciate because I've not been to a lot of public settings that have those. And just having opportunities where, it's possible to get away from overstimulation is very important. Reducing stigma of wearing things like headphones in public is an accommodation. And beyond that, things like these glasses happen to be tinted. You can't see it right now because I'm not in sunlight, but when I go outside, the UV rays turn these things dark, which is a subtle accommodation because a lot of people just wear that because they like sunglasses, but it helps a lot with my light sensitivity.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are a lot of different things like that. Some people are trying to create workplace accommodations. I actually recently worked on a book that is trying to research that things like an orientation process that explicitly explains aspects of social protocol and expectations of when paperwork should be returned and how things should be done, which tend to be picked up by most people passively.
Yeah. Oh, I felt that even my first year teaching, I remember asking people, I'm like, how are, and it was like a fire drill. And I was like, oh, where does my class go? And they were like, oh, just like look in the notebook or something. And I'm like, what notebook? Like, no one told me about a notebook. And it was like, or maybe they'd even have a notebook. They're like, oh, yeah, just like go out to the front and go next to like someone else's class. I'm like, is that where I'm supposed to go? Like, I, I don't know. You're gonna put me next to a road? Like I'm the special education classroom. I wouldn't say all my kids like to sit in a line right now. Like it was like a very interesting conversation that I remember leaving being like what if there was a like what if it was a fire? Like what if there was a fire and I was like sitting here like what am I supposed to do? And I just thought like why is there not like specific details lined up so if anybody like if a substitute came in all that information would be there. That feels like there could be, and that's like as simple as that. I'm sure in the medical field, there are so many, so many more moving pieces of like all of the expectations of, I'm assuming the huge amount of paperwork that you have to do. Um, but yeah, I remember each time doing something, I'd be like, hey, where do I turn this in? Like when do I have to turn this in? Is this done now? And uh, happens all the time. It's like people just kind of forget it. But I love those accommodations that you talked about at Tash because I do every time I go to a conference, I usually leave or a conference that's like focused around the disabled community. I usually leave being like, man, like that wasn't hard. Like they had accommodations. Like we all were able to access the information. Why is this so hard for like able-bodied people? Like why? Um, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all those examples.
Yeah, well, and just to add one other thing, I
Yeah.
like to think of accommodations in terms of options because, as we are all sick of explaining to a lot of able-bodied people, if you've ever pushed a cart or ridden a bike, you understand why curb cuts are handy. And
Yeah.
it's not a bad thing to have more options available to everyone. The whole, but what if someone who doesn't need it use it? That's absurd. Accommodations are for everyone for any reason, and it's never an inherently bad thing to have them. Um,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's part of the jump in thinking that people just haven't gotten over a lot of the time.
I see that a lot when I try to get, I'm on a nonprofit where we try to get inclusive playground equipment donated to schools. And whenever we post about inclusive playgrounds, there will always be someone like, oh, so everything should just be ramps because like some people need ramps. And I'm like, no, I don't like, why? Have you been outside? Like you see, there's a ramp and a stair option. Like I'm not saying let's like down with stairs. Like let's just also have other like alternatives. Like and which a lot of playgrounds are starting to jump on this, but that's what a lot I feel like people fear inclusion. And I mean, very recently, I mean, the whole DEI thing. Like I feel like people fear it because they think things are being taken away from them when it's like that's not what's happening. Like we're trying to get everybody. Oh, someone just said something where it was like we're trying to get everyone at the table and like have a table big enough for everyone. Oh, I think it was Michael. I think it was Michael's shirt. Oh man, I'll have to I totally forgot what his shirt said, but it was something like that where it's like, you know, how do we make sure we're hearing like about from all groups to be successful? Okay, so research. I showed you that article. I already forgot the name I have it up to. Let's see. Um, well, it's by the Jill Barchet, but she's not the one.
Yeah, it looks like it's Douglas
Uh,
Fuchs.
yeah, and it's called Top Scholar Says Evidence for Special Education Inclusion is Fundamentally Flawed. And I sent that to you because I know that you are huge in research and you probably also have access to so much more research than the average human. Um, But yeah, I did feel like that was a little bit of a clickbait thing. And because I feel like the people who shared it, where I saw it, it was like, maybe inclusion doesn't work. They're telling us it works great. And I was like, what? That's not even what the article's saying. So I've been trying to do videos about it. Research. What do you feel like you find in research that, uh, I don't know, supports inclusive education, supports like the importance of better social models? Medical models. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say I'm not big in research. I'm just, involved in research. But,
Okay,
you know,
I seriously, you were gonna say that you're not big in research. I promise you, from compared to me, I would say that you are huge in reading research. But
well,
sure,
but reading it,
in
sure.
the research world.
I, but yeah, so I think, and I'll get to the specific article in a second here, but
Yeah.
I think there are a couple of, very core structural issues for how we write about disability, especially in medical research. I haven't read a ton of research in other fields. I mean, I've read a lot of ABA research because it's important as an anti-ABA advocate to just be familiar with what their journals are writing. But there's a thing we talk about a lot in medicine called the pyramid of evidence, which is supposed to be a non-biased, formalized way to evaluate research quality, which I'm actually very fond of. Mathematically, it backs up very well. The statistics make a lot of sense. And basically, it's, at the bottom, you have things like expert opinion. And then at the top, you have things like systemic reviews that are compilations of other high quality studies. And towards the top, you have things like randomized controlled trials and you have prospective trials and things like that. So the idea is that the form of the research dictates what it can reasonably be said to prove, which
Hmm.
is a good way to approach things. But one very obvious hole that I've noticed in this is, well, not a hole so much, it's just a different perspective we don't aren't really trained to look at, is is outcomes of research and how we define what an appropriate primary and secondary outcome are and what we are looking to see happen. And the place where that comes up a lot in disability work is quite obviously using the medical model. The desired outcome is always less disabled or less disabled looking.
Yeah.
And that's not the outcome necessarily wanted by the community that they're studying. A great example of that, and this is not a disabled community, but it is one that is treated very similarly by the medical community, is the deaf community. Um, I have never met a deaf person or read work by a deaf author in support of cochlear implants. In fact, most deaf authors I'm familiar with are very strongly opposed to cochlear implants. They
Mhm.
argue that unless they are implanted very early in life, and even in that case, there is a very low chance of them working. They raise the risk of ear and brain infections. And in people who don't have a lot of residual hearing, they just, can sell them. They often cannot work at all. And at the age when they're often implanted, which is things like 3 to 4 years old, you can get issues where someone's brain is already developed to not use that kind of auditory processing, and so it's just white noise. Um, and I've never really seen the medical community dispute that. Um, Usually, the research supporting cochlear implants is about how, well, but it works for some of them and it makes them look less deaf because they don't sign.
Yeah.
And which is sort of the same oralist nonsense that we've been hearing for 100 years. But the thing is that, yes, there are randomized controlled trials showing that kids with cochlear implants hear better.
Yeah.
But that's not the primary outcome that the community cares about. And I have a very similar issue with ABA research because the primary outcome for ABA is, do these kids look autistic a lot of the time? It's not how long we live. It's not our vulnerability to medical comorbidities. It's not our long-term psychological health. And that last one in particular, there is a growing body of research over the last 5 years that has been showing that ABA is correlated with greater depression and suicide rates. Um,
Yeah.
and but the thing is, those things aren't supposed to matter to us because we are supposed to want to be less autistic first and foremost, and that is supposed to be our priority in life if we have any priorities at all. We're not really seen as people enough to have our own views. But and so kind of getting back to this specific, research. Um, so a couple of things kind of leapt out at me from just sort of skimming this, and you watched me skim this. I foolishly did not look at your email thoroughly enough when I initially got it.
I mean,
But
you responded. I loved our email conversation as well. I felt like you asked me questions that I'm like, wow, no one's ever asked me that before. Like, but I felt like you were thorough, but continue the article.
yeah, so I'm going to quote Fuchs here. Um, Some number of kids with disabilities can and should be in general classrooms. It's manifestly obvious that they're doing reasonably well. They should stay there. But for a majority, they need intensive instruction, and we know how to provide intensive instruction. And my objection to this and is that, what do we mean by need? And what do you mean by intensive? You have to define your terms. And I know that in special education classrooms, you can have, more one-to-one time, you have smaller class sizes, and that can be very beneficial, I would argue, to any students.
Mhm.
And he also has this argument later on that the research supporting inclusion has been self-selecting for kids who are less disabled. And that often means less visibly disabled. Let's be clear here.
Yeah.
It often means people who as non-disabled better. And so, yes, there is an implied skew there. He's not wrong. But I think that there is an argument to be made that he is not drawing a firm distinction between the two groups he is describing, and that there are probably other aspects of them that he's overlooking. Um, I think that, a very obvious example that leaps out at me is when we talk about diagnosing kids with developmental disabilities, the exact choice of diagnostic label and the selection of things like functioning labels tend to rely very heavily on race and class.
Mhm.
And so, you can say kids with more severe diagnostic labels are more likely to be in special education. But that's another way of saying that kids who have other disadvantages stacked against them are more likely to be in special education. And when he says that kids benefit from it, he doesn't really define what he means. Maybe it would, if I read the original report, which I did not, I just read this kind of
The
clickbaity
and it's not
summary,
out.
maybe
The
it goes into
original
more
report's
detail.
not out.
Okay.
Like it's coming out.
Well, then he shouldn't be given interviews. But you know, the but my point is, maybe the outcomes he's looking at, I don't know if they're academic performance. I don't know if he's looking at, the able-bodied kids and if he's concerned about kids being disruptive or whatever. And I don't know if he's talking about social outcomes because a lot of the time, when people talk about autistic kids, the original research supporting ABA claimed that we perform better socially if under intense ABA instruction, which is not, I would argue, why most people go to school.
Yeah.
And I think there is a tendency in disability education research, and you may have noticed this too, to conflate better outcomes with quieter,
With what?
quieter,
Oh, with quieter?
less disruptive. Yeah,
Yeah.
less disruptive.
Yeah. Well, I know that that is like such an area that people talk a lot about. Like when I like I've had people respond a lot like, well, if a kid's screaming in class, I'm just supposed to ignore them. And I'm like, what? I like no. And what's wrong with you? Like, why is that your question towards me? Like, okay, it sounds like you have a child who's not feeling safe. Like, how about you go help that child and like get the support that they need? Um, but yeah, I really want his article to come out. They're saying that it's going to come out to the public, even though they are going to also publish it somewhere. But he's like, apparently he wants this free so everyone can see it. So I'm hoping that he does define those terms because I do think that that is just like, that's like a hard thing to define when you're trying to, like, you can't say inclusion is going to work for people with this disability or this severity of this disability. Like that's just not how that works. Like every person is different. And like what you were saying of like someone having like a smaller class size for a certain lesson, like that could be beneficial to everybody, not just this like one autistic child that has it in their IEP.
Well, and I'm glad what you just mentioned about different kinds of disabilities, because, and again, not a disabled group, but treated similarly to it. One of the things that the deaf community has done to separate themselves from the disability community in the last 20 years is they're very firmly against inclusion for the most part in the US. And
Yeah.
there are reasons for that, which are communication-based reasons and cultural reasons, which is a very separate thing. But they do tend to get lumped in, especially, people who are multiply disabled, who, might be you know, deaf and also using a wheelchair and also have intellectual disability, have a lot of other things going on. And the question of what's best for that child becomes very individualized.
Yeah. So okay, so I used to work with the deaf blind community, uh, in like, whatever that yes, I used to work with the deafblind community and I've grown up like learning sign language. So I've met a lot of deaf people and I've talked a lot about the deaf culture of like capital D deaf versus like lowercase d deaf. And then deaf plus, like if there are multiple disabilities. And for so long, I was like, I mean, because I just kept thinking of like a deaf school would be like segregation, that you're like taking yourself away from the community that like we're all here. Like, you're gonna be done with school. Like, where are you gonna go now? But it was very recently that someone said like, you know, even when they're always out and even with accommodations, it's like they just can't access it the same as like when they are around a group of deaf people and how I think it was like an argument with the least restrictive environment that they were like their least restrictive environment is to be around a lot of deaf people so they can communicate and like feel a part of this like community that also feels like they're smart because they don't feel that with non-deaf people. So you see
Yeah,
my
well,
arms are flaying for anyone who's watching the video. I know sign language and so it's really hard for me sometimes to not like I want to sign these words sometimes. It like is this natural thing. Anyways, thank you for bringing that up because I do feel like I mean usually when I talk a lot of stuff like about inclusion is like I talk a lot about like the deaf community and the autistic community, and then it feels like those are the two biggest cultural groups that I seem to notice, talk about. I don't know.
Well, and I think there are a lot of cultural reasons and historical reasons for both of those, which do tend to unfortunately put us in broader prominence. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that was it.
Yeah.
Um, do you have
Uh,
something else to say about that? Because you talked about something else that I want to talk about.
Well, I was just going to very briefly mention that a
Yeah.
community I've been trying to learn more about in recent years because they're very marginalized and only sort of beginning to find their voice in the broader cultural stage is the schizospec community.
Okay.
uh, which are say to say people, schizophrenia, schizoid personality, schizoid personality disorder, not schizoid, that's the one thing, schizotypal, schizoaffective disorder, sort of this kind of spectrum of conditions.
I didn't
And
even
about,
realize there was more than one. So this is
um,
educational to me.
and yeah, and again, part of that gets back to the DSM being badly defined, which is its whole other problem.
Yeah.
But the I've been trying to read more by authors with those conditions and by posters and people who talk about it and about some of the things that they're discussing and things like different sensoria and different sensitivities to things like light and sound, which are very similar to what is experienced in autism, to a lot of the same prejudices around empathy that we experience, but also to things being very different because there are things like greater risk of suicidality and low interest and these effective things, as well as things like hallucinations that can make it difficult to be safe in public because people might notice you behaving oddly and attack you or something. And I and it's a community that's been very historically marginalized and very historically hated because of sanism, which is sort of a subcategory of ableism. And I'm not trying to say I speak for these people or I know anything about what they're getting at, but what I'm kind of getting at is that, you know, it's a community that's been a lot more out of the limelight than autistic and ADHD communities. And it is important to, note that these other disabilities who we haven't heard from as much yet might have different needs or different interests. And it's something to keep in mind as we develop policy.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this is it's like okay, gosh. I do feel like the deaf community and autistic community are kind of starting to get more shown, like more representation. And even people like with Down syndrome, I feel like I'm hearing more stories like being published about just like showing some more representation. Um, but yeah, I would say like schizophrenia, like I'm thinking of like mental health issues. I don't know if that is the best way to say that. Do you want to correct it? You looked like you were about to correct it.
I've heard a lot of different terminology. The Mad Pride movement is kind of what I've been reading a lot of the literature of, but and I have heard people use the term mental illness, but I'm not sure if that's a specifically reclaimed slur that only they can use, or so I'm not sure. But um,
Okay. Well, because I was gonna, and I don't, I guess this is where I see it the most is where people who are living without homes, who are like out, who might be seen like, yeah, what you were saying was like having hallucinations, and people are instantly judging them of like, and I kind of think it's like out of fear, where people are just like, well, I don't know what's happening with them. Like, God, let's go somewhere else. Where I would like to know more because I would like to know how, like, just as a person walking by, like, how I would be able to support. Like, is it better? Is it better if we just like ignore you? Because I think I have read a book about someone who is schizophrenic, and it was like, it was something where it was like, I have to finish this hallucination like before coming back, or like, I can't really remember what it said, but it was something where it's like, you can't get me out of this. Like, I need to get through it kind of by myself. But I don't know. That might be a whole nother topic. I don't know how much you know about this
I
subject.
don't, and I'm not going to pretend to be an authority on it. So
Man, if anybody has schizophrenia in their family line or friends, tell me, call me, or call me, message me. Okay, I want to talk about ABA. So I have heard a lot from people, I would say from the autistic community, who are very against ABA. But I also am friends with people who do ABA. And recently I talked to some people who like practice ABA, but when I talk to them, they're like, we do recognize that there was this really bad, like it was like the practices were used bad, poorly. And they're like that's so and I've been okay. Oh my gosh, where do I even want to go with this? Do you feel like the ABA, anything that happens in ABA could be used differently in a more like neuro-affirming way?
No.
So why? Because I'd
So
love
I'm
to hear.
sorry. No, I need to dive into that a little more. All right. So I think that when ABA practitioners say that, I think that they're speaking from a very fundamental misunderstanding of the autistic objections to ABA.
Okay.
Because ABA did change about 18 years ago. It became less physically violent. I'm not going to say not physically violent because there are still ABA practitioners that use physical force. It became less
Yeah.
focused on aversives. Again, not true of all of them. About 53% of ABA providers still use aversives in some form. But there's sort of this perception in the ABA profession that the autistic objections to ABA are based solely on methodology. Um, and that is not true. No, don't get me wrong. I would strongly prefer it if the JRC closed, and if the Judge
What's the
Rotenberg Center.
JRC?
The Judge Rotenberg Center. They are an ABA using institution that uses electric shocks as a form of aversives.
Oh my God.
They
Still?
also, yes, they
I
also
thought we
regularly
got rid of all
starve
of them.
inmates there.
Ugh.
Yeah, so I would be happier if they did that, but I would point out that the JRC has presented at the last three ABA international conferences. They are still an accepted part of the broader ABA community, even if their practices are not shared. And that's not because all ABA practitioners are on board to slap autistic children. It's because ABA is based on a much broader philosophical misunderstanding of autism that is itself based in a deep well of dehumanization. Um, if you also look at, ABA International's conference proceedings, which, I do every year, they have forums on dog training, on applications of animal training to ABA. And that is not incidental. It has a lot of historical precedent. Ivar Lovaas very explicitly based his understanding of the autistic brain on animals and on stimulus response machines. He believed and stated repeatedly that we are not people, that you need to build a person out of nothing, and that we are empty shells, and
Yeah.
that therefore it is acceptable to mistreat us or to not actually attempt to reach us as individuals because of that. And while ABA practitioners might not approve of his use of physical violence, they still buy into this very fundamental concept that we do not need to be talked to. We do not need to be taught. We do not need to understand why we are doing what we are doing. We need to be trained. And the problem with, well, there are a lot of problems with that, but
Yeah.
you know, in an educational sense, I'm sure you're aware that training a kid to say 2 times 2 is 4 is not the same thing as teaching them.
Yeah.
You tell a 3-year-old to say that, but that doesn't mean they understand multiplication. Um, and so it creates this very fundamental educational gap because ABA takes up a lot of time. It is a waste of time that could be spent actually providing education. B, it does not itself teach critical thinking or cognitive skills, and in fact actively discourages them in the name of greater compliance. And C, because of this kind of emphasis on compliance, that's where sort of those downstream negative effects I was talking about come from.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and a lot of this, some of this has been professionally backed and by studies, and some of it is anecdotal stuff I've learned from the community. Um, so you can take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt here, but survivors of ABA are more likely to be depressed. They are more likely to be anxious. They're more likely to be suicidal. And the suicidality is true of all high functioning autistics, incidentally. And that's just because of the pressure. That a lot of that is theorized to be because of the pressure of masking.
Yeah.
But ABA encourages masking, so it does increase that risk. And then the one that I've heard mostly anecdotally is that survivors of ABA are often more vulnerable to abusive partnerships and abusive relationships later on, which
Yeah.
makes sense because one of the core tenets of ABA is that your sensorium, your physical comfort, your needs in order to learn and to internalize information are not real and are not important. It is important that you do this thing regardless of how you feel about it. ABA practitioners rather famously train children to make eye contact. They train children to accept things like handshakes and hugs. That has been true since Lovaas's first experiments.
Yeah.
And what that actually teaches kids is, not that hugs are good. It teaches them that your physical discomfort is not as important as someone else wanting to make contact with you, which is something
Yeah.
that is very easy to translate into sexual abuse vulnerability.
Oh,
Um,
totally. Well, so it's I mean everything that you're saying, this is what I've heard when I talk to people. My dog is crying at the door. Um, when I talk to people who are anti-ABA, this is what they say. I mean, they're like it encourages masking. It's not like neuroaffirming. It's not
and
like
and I
it's not
and since
safe
the
and it's
technique
bad.
and since the techniques are based on training, I don't think those can be repurposed in a meaningful way educationally.
Well, and this is what I was talking to with my friends who are in ABA because when they describe what they do, it doesn't sound like this. Like it doesn't sound like how you described it, but I'm saying like this isn't the first time I've heard ABA described like how you are describing it. But when I talk to my friends who are in ABA, I'm like, those don't seem like the same thing. So why do they have the same name? Like, why?
Oh, insurance.
Oh,
So
that's, I do
ABA
remember
is
parents talking to me about that.
ABA is the only, therapy for autism covered by insurance in the US, because it is considered the research-based gold standard for
Yeah.
terrible reasons. This all gets back to how terrible medical research on disability is. And so a lot of programs that are not ABA or do not use ABA will brand themselves as ABA, which creates a lot of muddying of the water about what ABA is. But if you read
Interesting.
ABA professional journals, and if you look at their conference proceedings and if you read ABA books and literature, ABA is a very specific philosophy and program of treatment that is not, conducive to education.
So how do we get a different behavior therapy in in insurance that will make it better? That won't be ABA.
Medical research. It's very much a question of legitimizing alternatives. And part of that is questioning what outcomes we are looking for. Because the thing is, if you want someone to not act autistic, the thing that forces them to act neurotypical is going to be the gold standard every time. But if you change the treatment goal, ABA stops looking good.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a great article from 2022 that I wanted to recommend to you, which
Yeah.
is it's a medical article. I'm just going to look it up real quick so I get the
Yeah.
title right. Autistic Space, a novel framework for meeting the needs of autistic people in healthcare settings.
Oh my
Um,
gosh, that's long. Okay, I'm gonna write down autistic space and hope that I can find it.
yep, and
Or I'll
space is
email
an
you.
acronym. And it's sorry, 2023.
Okay.
So this was published by Doherty et al. And basically, it's about the construction of environmentally safer spaces for autistic people that reduce the odds of things like meltdowns.
Yeah.
Um, the idea being that, instead of viewing it as a set of behaviors to target, which is the psychiatric view, it's better to view autism from the ground up as a form of, neurological complexity that just needs to be, managed environmentally, which is a much more humane approach to us on the
Yeah.
whole. Um, Devin Price's book, Unmasking Autism, has a take on it that I actually really like because he tries to start with, let's not start with the behaviors that people assign to us. Let's start with what it feels like to be autistic and go from there. And so he starts with the way that we interpret details versus big picture things and the way that we interpret, sights and sounds and all these things, and starts talking about why different environments can be overwhelming and how we respond to that and how that creates the patterns that neurotypicals dislike about us. And
Yeah.
I think starting from that kind of mechanistic understanding is what really needs to fundamentally change in how we approach autism. So I don't really like the question, what behavior therapies do we need? Because I don't think we need behavior therapies. I think that we need to actually understand what it means to call something neurodivergence and to
Yeah.
understand that it is a neurological condition. One of the things I say very often is that psychiatry that we understand is not psychiatry, it's neurology. Calling a psychiatrist to, understand something is like saying, well, I don't know what that constellation is, and I can't find the astronomer, so let's get an astrologer instead.
Yeah.
I don't understand what this chemical is doing, so instead of calling the chemist or the pharmacist, let's call the alchemist. Going to
Yeah.
an unscientific profession because you don't understand what someone's brain is doing is an admission of failure.
Yeah. No, I think that is really spot on. I mean, because like, oh my gosh, I do think the ins I mean, I'm now feeling like a lot of people who do ABA in any sort of positive way. I mean, I'm sure that you don't like that sentence at all,
I
but
know what you mean, but yeah.
I feel like it's because they're just trying to get around the system of like, okay, like fine, insurance cover it, but I'm going to like give this kid the support they need to like succeed. Like they're not
The
because
problem being that muddies the waters.
yeah, no, it totally muddies the water, but it's also really hard because I'm like, I don't know, what are they going to do? Like, how do they get research? Like, that feels like years of data collecting and working and not getting financial support for the families and you. Like, I don't, how would that,
Well,
I
I
mean,
think
would
the
you have to be like a
place
private company then?
Well, I think this is one of those things that we can attack from multiple fronts. I think that we need to create better, more rigorous research that is actually reflective of the Nothing About Us Without Us movement and the needs of the autistic community. But I also think that on the educational end of things, we need to disincentivize schools from demanding that their kids get treatment.
Yeah.
We need to create an environment where kids can ask for, where an IEP does not have to include ABA, where an IEP can be focused on neurological interventions, where it can be focused on these other things. My IEP when I was a kid did not say ABA. It said that I could leave a room if I was upset so I could calm down in a more comforting sensory environment. It didn't say sensory, but because my parents didn't quite understand that. But the point was, it was an intervention that was not focused on my behavior as a problem. It was focused on, the underlying emotions and neurology and environment that made that difficult. Um, and that's something we can do now. One
Yeah.
of the very few things I will say for the US over Canada is that in Canada, kids are legally required to go through ABA or cannot get a high school diploma if they're
Oh,
autistic. Um,
I did not know that.
it is an unfortunate, nationalized healthcare is a wonderful thing, and standardization can be a very great thing for creating uniform public schools. But the issue with that is that if there's a widespread misunderstanding of a minority group, it gets propagated into national law. And one of the
Wow.
US's advantages in that regard, people talk about states as laboratories of democracy and all that sort of thing, is that we can experiment and we can individually say, this is not how I want my child to be treated. And we have authority to do that in our culture because parents have a lot of authority and a lot of power over how they manage things.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that the important thing is, stuff like this podcast, telling people, your child does not have to go into ABA. You have options, and those options can be based on what adult autistic people think would have helped them. They can be
Yeah.
based on what science that has not been adopted by ABA practitioners says. And it can be informed by what your child individually tells you they need.
Yes. Well, I know you just kind of dropped the nothing about us without us. And I feel like that is so important just in general. And I mean, I know because personally, I like as someone with a platform who is able-bodied, it's like, but is a disability ally. Like I'm constantly trying to be like, like, how can I best get your voice and put it here? Because all I am saying is like from my experience, and that is as an able-bodied person, which is a very different experience. And I mean, I overlook things all the time that I wouldn't even see as an accommodation because like it's not even something I look for. Um, do you want to talk for a second about nothing without us? Nothing about us without us?
Sure.
Okay, I
I'll try
know
to be
we're
quick.
running out of time, but
Yep.
I feel like this is really important.
So this was a term originally created by the anti-apartheid movement. I want to be very clear. That the disability movement co-opted this from South Africa, which was about the development of local policy goals, including members of the communities that they were designed to affect. And as that applies to, American research, what that is often used to mean by disabled communities is that you should formally hire consultants from disabled communities at every stage of the research process. They should be involved in the development of outcomes. They should be involved in study design. There are very obvious holes in research that we tend to notice immediately that the able-bodied researchers studying us don't. And a great example of someone who does that very well is if you have the misfortune of still being on Twitter, like me, Anne Menmont is an independent researcher who does fantastic work discussing the methodology and pitfalls around studies of autistic people. And so people like that, exist. There are databases of us out there, and not me specifically, but senior expert researchers. And the primary issue is just finding the funding to hire another consultant. And it's very important that these people be paid, they be equal good participants, they be researchers, not subjects, that you treat these people with respect. And until such time as we are formally and openly part of these institutions, that needs to be outside consultants, which is another
Yeah.
reason to build up the research community within institutions and to build up that institutional diversity.
Do you do research?
Yes, not frequently because I do a lot of clinical work these days, but I do what I can.
Are you
And I am,
hoping to get more into it?
yes. Uh, and I also am occasionally consulted as a doctor and an expert who is allowed to be consulted on stuff now about research studies. I'm often tapped as an unpaid reviewer. It's a little funny that I'm now only an authority on autistic people now that I have a degree that did not teach me anything about them. Um, but
Yeah. Cool. Man, I just feel like I could talk to you like all day about, I would love to just hear like more and more stuff about, you really made me like, I guess I don't even know how to talk because I just have like so many things in my head happening because I mean, ABA in general, I've heard both sides and I mean, even though I know people have complained about insurance, I've never even thought about like how that like muddles the water, like the what ABA means, and then the difference between Canada and America, like that. I didn't even really know how that worked in Canada. Like that feels so I don't know, less freedom, like
it's
but in such a one like specific way.
Well, sort of like I talked about at Tash, ableism is a bipartisan issue in the US.
Yeah.
And the same underlying ableist assumptions fuel Democrats and Republicans. And often, as a result, you can find allyship in very unexpected political places. For the very simple reason that the freedom to raise your own damn kids is, and to not have, government control over how you do so, depending on context, that can be a very right-wing position. And right-wing parents can get what I mean when I say that in a way that left-wing parents don't always. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we both attended that talk on charter schools and both the issues there. But
Yes,
so I'm not saying it's a unilateral positive to have private alternatives or charter schools, but it gets complicated.
it
And
does.
sorry, last thing I'll say is that
No, don't apologize. Keep talking.
the only government that has put any legal restrictions on the use of ABA on autistic people is actually the government of the Netherlands.
Oh, I thought the Netherlands were kind of ahead for education. Or wait, I might,
Well, it's not a question of ahead or behind. It's this very specific issue.
yeah.
Um,
Or
but
Switzerland?
my point is, it's totally random. Who's going to, have the right person in the room to explain this concept?
Yeah. Well, I was just reading a book it's called Hidden Potential by Adam Grant. I don't know. I love him. Um, but he is like, a white cisgender able-bodied male. And he talks about that at times that he's like, I understand like where my privilege is and but he talks a lot about just like what does he call himself? Organizational psychologist, I think. Or gosh, I should probably know for how much I love reading his books.
Uh,
Um,
and
but he studied a school in another country and talked about how they're like performing like very high and they're like more inclusive. They kind of, I mean, he didn't say that they do like a universal design of learning there, but they do kind of like but they don't call it UDL. It's just like their culture. It's just like their way of life is like, oh, well, you're a part of our community. How can we make sure that you're accessing this information? And that's like a priority to them. And because of that, we've been seeing like good outcomes.
Yeah.
Okay. Here are the tarot cards. Usually I
Mhm.
tell people to like just think of a question. You could even be like, how's my year going to be? How is work going to be? How's my day going to be?
Sure.
Any sort of question. Is that the question you want? How's your day going to be?
Yeah, how about that?
You don't even want to know about your week? Your day's already
Nah,
kind of
but
over.
weeks too far in the future.
It's like already almost 12 over there.
All right, let's say week then. And I know how my week's going to be, but let's say how's my week going to be?
Okay, here we go. I've already shuffled. I never know how to. Okay. Oh, look at that cute cat. Okay, this is Queen of Wands,
Okay.
and it's a little cat with two tails holding a wand. Oh, and has three crowns, which is cute. And they seem to have, they hide like little planets sometimes on these pictures, which I just
That
love
is
so
cute.
much. Okay, this is a fun one. So, this is about independence and confidence. The queen lies in the warm sun in the blooming flowers, living her best life. You know how to make things happen. You are bold and courageous in your actions and you follow through. Don't shy away from this power. Share your enthusiasm with the world. Is something great happening this week?
No, but hopefully something will.
Well, it will now because the Queen of Cats says so. The Queen of Wands, I mean.
Yeah, I
And
think
you
they're all
can't
cats.
disobey the Queen of Wands as she
What are your
basks
favorite?
in the sun.
All right.
Well, thank you, Al, so much for educating me more and more every time I talk to
Let
you.
me ramble at you.
No,
And
I love it so much.
it's a close. Can I just say one other thing? Sorry, I promise it's
Yeah.
not a huge rabbit hole. That essay I mentioned at the beginning about American history and disability being used as a catch-all insult. For some reason, the book is available online, so I'll send you the link to the PDF.
Oh,
But it's from the Disability Studies Reader from 2015, the 2013-2015 edition. Um, and it's the first, it's actually the second essay in it, or which is Disability and the Justification of Inequality in American History by Douglas Bainton.
okay.
And it just really changed my perspective on, what disability means to people, on this idea
Yeah.
that it's such a fundamentally inferior category in popular parlance that you can use it as a threat or an insult against everyone. The whole idea that biological difference is a basis for inequality is just baked into society at every level. And
Yeah.
it really takes a second of stepping back to go, wait a second, the idea of biological difference, that is based on the concept of disability, which is biological difference. The idea of using it as a basis of inequality is based on this underlying assumption that every human being makes that that's okay. If you can prove a biological difference, you can prove a social difference.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I just love how you explain things. I'm gonna end the recording. Thank you so much, Al, for being
Thank you
here.
for having me.
Um, Thanks again to everybody who made it all the way through. Thank you, Al, for being here with me today. I even re-listening to this episode, I just enjoyed it so much. So I hope everyone else did too. Any articles or resources that we talked about, I'll have below in the show notes. So feel free to go look into all of those fun resources. And I hope you have a great day. Inclusion starts with you, and I just want to help.